Okay, well, so in one of your Facebook posts here, you argued that we should have at least like a middling credence that a functionally human-like AI would have an immaterial mind.
Mhm.
Um, First, I guess, just for the listeners and maybe for me too, like, what do you mean by middling credence? What should we take that to mean?
Yeah, so a middling credence means a credence that's not. So a credence is just kind of your level of confidence in a proposition. How likely is it that you think it's true? A middling credence is a level of confidence that's kind of vaguely in the middle, not really low, not really high. So
Yeah.
um, you have a middling credence in something if you think it's not extremely likely to be correct and not extremely likely to be incorrect.
Okay.
And I believe the conclusion of the argument that I posted was that we should have at least a middling credence. I don't think I argue that we should have at most a middling credence, though I suppose I also think that that's true, that that's not something that I argued in that particular.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's
I mean,
fascinating.
at least my own level of confidence is very middling. I mean, it would be artificial to put precise numbers on it, but somewhere in the 20% to 80% range roughly
Okay.
seems reasonable to me.
Okay. Yeah, and again, that's for a functionally human-like AI.
That's right.
And then so you give this just like two-step argument, and the one is that it's an analogous case if we met a alien. There we go. Jeez. If we met an alien that was functionally human-like, and we could, maybe even speak with it, or it had a translator or whatever, it looked like it was an intelligent being, then we would uh, have reason to think, at least a middling credence, that it has an immaterial soul, and that would be like step two. Just, maybe I'll let you lay it out for us a little bit better than that. Does that sound
Yeah,
right?
so that it was meant to just be a kind of simple two premise argument for the conclusion that we should have at least a middling credence that a functionally human-like AI would have an immaterial soul. First of all, this is all conditional upon the assumption that we
Right.
ourselves have immaterial souls. Of course, that's controversial. A lot of people would reject that. Setting those issues aside right now, basically, I'm speaking to people who accept substance dualism or something like that. About human persons, and then raising the question, how confident should we be that the same would be true about functionally human-like AI? Yeah, and so then, as you said, the first premise is, look, if we met seemingly intelligent aliens, extraterrestrial life forms that pass whatever behavioral tests you like for intelligence, maybe they have language and complex society and civilization and so on. But let's assume that in terms of their material constitution, they're very different from us. Maybe they're not carbon-based life forms. They have some like different kind of molecular constitution. Maybe they're made of green goo or whatever. The key
Yeah.
point is that they behave and function in ways that kind of abstractly resemble human beings, but when it comes to their low-level material constitution, they're very different from us. And the claim is, if we met such aliens, we should have at least middling credence that they have immaterial souls, at least conditional upon the assumption that we do. And I believe in the post, I didn't really say anything to argue for this. I find in conversation that pretty much everyone wants to accept this claim. This just seems very intuitive and natural to a lot of people. So I think most of the action would be in the second premise. The second premise says, well, if that first claim is true, then we should also have at least middling credence that functionally human-like artificial intelligence has an immaterial soul. So functionally human-like means roughly. So first of all, it behaves in kind of human-like ways. It passes whatever behavioral tests you like for
Yeah.
general intelligence. It can perform any behavioral task, at least at the human level. It can carry on conversations. It can fold laundry. It can play chess, at least at the human level, and so on for other tasks. And somewhat more specifically, if we look at its more detailed causal organization, let's just suppose that it resembles human beings at a kind of abstract level of causal organization. So you might have this if you created an AI that was implemented via a detailed simulation of a human brain. So
Yeah.
maybe a large artificial network of neurons where the connections between neurons in the artificial neural network are somehow isomorphic to the connections between neurons in a human brain. So this would be an artificial intelligence that is as human-like in abstract functional respects as it's possible to be, but still implemented on a physical computer. So the thought is, if we accept soulhood in the alien case, we should accept AI ensoulment, at least for these functionally human-like artificial intelligences. And the argument for that second premise is, well, prima facie, there's a very nice analogy between the alien case and the AI case. In both cases, they resemble us in kind of abstract behavioral and functional respects relevant to our mental lives, and differ from us at a kind of in terms of their low-level material constitution.
Yeah.
And if you think that differences in low-level material constitution aren't enough to dismiss alien ensoulment, then you should also think that that's not a good reason to be dismissive of AI ensoulment. And so the challenge for people who do want to be dismissive of AI ensoulment, who are very confident that functionally human-like AIs would not have immaterial souls, is what's the relevant difference between aliens and between the alien case and the AI case?
Yeah. Yeah, and you give some of those differences. I want to talk about those, but real quick, I just wanted to you said that most substance dualists ought to affirm one, or just will affirm one, or maybe from your own experience have, and I think that's because it mirrors the like a multiple realizability argument, like from Putnam against the type, at least the type identity theorists, where it's like, look, our dog has pain states. And even though it has different neural circuitry, and maybe they don't have C fibers, maybe we don't even have C fibers because everyone else points to C fibers, but who knows what the real mechanism is. But yeah, like an alien, that all of this the multiple realizability is shown, like I think pretty strongly that type uh type identity theories are false, and then token ones are kind of like a functionalist theory, though I know some token folks would say no. Um, so you're just doing that same move, but for the substance dualist, and saying like, well, look, why wouldn't we think that if there was an alien? And I think there's a couple other objections that I want to deal with, like maybe some theological ones about like being image bearers of God type stuff that come
Okay.
from the theological circles. But first, maybe we could get in on yours. You say that two main ones: AI isn't alive, and then AI aren't or AI are artifacts, and
Right.
for some reason, being an artifact like precludes ensoulment. So yeah, what are these arguments? Like, well, yeah, can you flesh them out for us?
Yeah, so the challenge, as I said, for those who are dismissive of AI ensoulment is point me to the relevant difference between the AI case and the alien case. And then, yeah, so here are two things that I often hear as candidate relevant differences. So one thing I sometimes hear as well, the key difference is that the alien is alive. They possess life. Whereas the artificial intelligence, well, it's a mere machine. It is not a living thing. And then presumably the background idea here is something like life is a precondition for ensoulment.
Mm,
Only living things are eligible for possessing souls. So there are a few reasons why I'm not really convinced by this particular response. So first of all, like, I just don't see a ton of reason why we should accept that life is a precondition for possessing an immaterial soul. I mean, that could be right. I can't rule it out. I certainly can't rule it out conclusively, but I personally don't think that we have very strong reasons to accept that. So, if we don't have strong reasons to accept that life is a necessary condition for ensoulment, then I think we just can't be dismissive of the hypothesis that a functionally human-like AI would have an immaterial soul. So that's the first thing. The second point is a little bit more subtle, but it's Well, I'm actually not totally convinced that an AI wouldn't be alive, at
Right.
least in the sense relevant to this particular response. So it might help to distinguish two different views of life, a kind of reductive view and a non-reductive view. So according to the non-reductive view, which I take it is probably the dominant view among philosophers today, it's certainly the consensus view among naturalistically minded philosophers. According to the reductive view, uh, to be alive is just a matter of performing sufficiently many of the physical functions and behaviors characteristic of paradigm cases of life. So being alive is not some extra special ingredient that some physical systems have. It's just a matter of doing things like reproducing, metabolizing, maintaining homeostasis, growing, things like this. So if
Okay.
you exhibit sufficiently many of the features and functions characteristic of paradigm cases of life, then you count as alive. That's just all there is to being alive, according to this kind of deflationary or reductive view. Um, Now, if you have that kind of view, I think it's it's certainly questionable whether an AI would be alive. I mean, it has a functionally human-like AI may exhibit many of the features and functions characteristic of life. So it may engage in a kind of reproduction by kind of making copies of its own code.
Oh, right. Yeah.
It may engage in a kind of like metabolic process. It's constantly maybe taking in energy and using that energy,
Hmm.
with different physical mechanisms than takes place in life, but there is a kind of metabolic process there. It may involve various kind of homeostatic control systems that are functionally analogous to those involved in living things. So there are at least like a number of kind of the characteristic features and functions of life may be present in the AI. So I would say it's at best a kind of verbal question whether the
Mm.
AI is alive. Like we could talk that way if we wanted to, or we could define life in a way that excludes the AI. But once you get to the point where you think like, well, it's just a kind of purely verbal or terminological or semantic question whether the AI is alive, then life sort of doesn't seem like a good candidate for being a necessary condition on ensoulment, because presumably it's not a merely verbal question whether the AI
Right.
has a soul. So on the other hand, you might accept a kind of like a non-reductive, more metaphysically inflationary conception of life. So a lot of Aristotelians, I think, have this kind of conception of life. Some like vitalists, where being
Yeah. I was
alive
gonna say vitalist.
in a
Yeah.
kind of like elan vital, which is like a non-physical force that's responsible for the physical functions that we observe in living things. So that's another view you might have of life. But I guess I think if that's your view of life, you shouldn't be very confident that an AI lacks that either.
Huh.
Because after all, these elan vitals or whatever kind of like non-physical ingredient is responsible for life, it's not the sort of thing that we can just directly observe. We can't just kind of peer in and check whether it's present. We presumably get at it by inference from
Yeah.
observed behavior and functioning. But as we've seen, the AI exhibits a lot of the characteristic behaviors and functions associated with life. And now, like at this stage in the argument, someone can't just say, oh no, because like there's some kind of like carbon specific signature for life, or so like the physical signs or symptoms of the elan vital are something that like is specific to our like physical biochemistry or something like that. You can't really say that if you accept the first premise of the argument, because you've already granted that that an alien can be ensouled, where by stipulation the alien has very different
Yeah.
physical biochemistry. So I guess I just want to say, like, even if life in some sense is a precondition for ensoulment, it's not at all clear that that functionally human-like AI would not count as being alive in the relevant sense.
Yeah, and that first premise is so gold because it's you could think of all sorts of different creatures like a gas cloud,
Mhm.
that no, and it's but it lights up or something when it's speaking to you. There's all sorts of amazing, really cool things you could do to look at that, or bring up like an octopi or something, octopi. Yeah, an octopus, and like or a cuttlefish and how they communicate in all sorts of crazy weird ways. Now just make it sentient in the same way we are.
Mhm.
I love that. I think another thing about the life being a precondition, it seems like it kind of gets the substance dualist view backwards, because I think a lot of substance dualists want to say it's the soul that's doing the enlivening, and
Yeah.
when you die, the soul leaves the body. It'd be really weird to think that the soul is gone, but the body's still alive. And you might bring up a case of like a vegetative state or something, but in that case, you have like an artificial soul doing the enlivening, in that it's, the all the machines doing that, what the soul was supposed to do. And you don't have to go in for like a weird vitalist uh, move, because the soul, it's the soul that's doing it, not some vital force. Unless you want to say that is a soul, but in that case, it's a little bit different than a spooky vital soul, vital source thing. So yeah, it seems like the life is a precondition is getting it backwards, but maybe I'm wrong there. Do you know? Are there substance? Am I wrong here? Yeah. What do you think?
Well, no, so I think that's a good point. I mean, there of course is a tradition of, I mean, that within the Aristotelian tradition,
Yeah.
the term soul is just used as whatever it is that's responsible for the life of living things, the first principle of life among
It's
those
like the
things that
formal
live.
cause, right?
Yeah. So yeah, and so if that's how you're thinking of soul, then there's a kind of analytic connection between having a soul and being
Oh,
alive.
right. Right.
Um, in which case, well, of course, you can't be alive if you don't have a soul, because a soul is just kind of defined as whatever it is that's responsible for life.
Yeah.
Um, but if that's how you're thinking of it, then, well, I guess it looks a little bit question begging to,
Hmm.
in the current context, to assume that a soul is not present, because or rather to assume that the AI is not alive, because
Yeah.
if being alive for you just means having a soul, then that's just the question under consideration right now. And
Right.
so if you say that the thing is not alive, i.e., it doesn't have a soul, my question is like, okay, why think that? That's just exactly what we're arguing about. Um, yeah, so that's the first thing to say there. I mean, my focus here has been, within the Aristotelian tradition, people will still distinguish between souls of the kinds that maybe plants have and animals have, and uh, immaterial souls of the kind that we have, where some
Right.
of the operations of immaterial souls don't involve a bodily organ, and in that sense, they're immaterial. And yeah, I mean, I'm speaking about the immaterial kind. I'm interested in the question of whether, you know functionally human like AI would have souls of the kind that we do. And so if
Yeah.
you think that that's the immaterial kind of soul that's relevantly different from plant souls or animal souls, that's the kind of soul under consideration here.
Okay. Yeah. That's really helpful. It's like whatever that thing is that is conscious, that that is conscious, like in us, whatever that may like. Because I'm glad you brought up the Aristotelians, because some of them might just go, oh no, false, because I think it's the intellect or something like that. It's like, well, okay, if that's what you mean by it, that's what we're meaning by soul or mind, or different people have different conceptions, but like whatever is, I think whatever is experiencing the phenomenal, qualia and stuff, right? Like that's what we're trying to pick out here, isn't that right?
Yeah. So certainly, I think, well, if you accept substance dualism, you should accept that possessing a soul is probably the thing that's responsible for your capacity to experience qualia and
Nice.
maybe exhibit other mental properties like thought and free choice and other things like that. But so certainly there's a tight connection between your soul and your mental properties. There's a question as to whether the soul is the bearer of the mental qualities, or whether it's merely that by which you have the mental qualities.
Huh.
And I'm not really meaning to weigh in on that particular debate. So
Okay.
one alternative to the view that it's the soul that possesses the mental qualities is the idea that, well, what you are is not just the soul, it's kind of a composite of body and soul. And the soul is that in virtue of which you're capable of having these qualia and thoughts and feelings and free choices and things like that. But it would be incorrect to say that the soul is the bearer of those things.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm meaning to remain neutral on those sorts of issues.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. This is gold, man. You helped me level up here. Um, so then we have the natural kind, or sorry, the artifact worry. I was going to bring in natural kinds as an objection too, so I accidentally showed my hand there. But
Um,
yeah, we have the artifact worry.
yeah, so maybe I'll say a little bit about that. So one thing I've heard quite a bit in conversation from people who are totally dismissive of the idea that an AI would have an immaterial soul is this claim that, well, AI belong to the category of artifact, and artifacts are ineligible for ensoulment. They're not the right kind of entity to get a soul, or yeah, to possess an immaterial soul. And I guess I'm not very convinced by this particular response. So, first of all, I don't think that there's anything very metaphysically deep about the artifact non-artifact distinction. So I think it would be wrongheaded to give that distinction a ton of weight in our theorizing about the metaphysics of mind. One reason why I think that is that whether something is an artifact is largely a matter of its causal history. Something's an artifact when it's intentionally produced by people in the right kind of way.
Right.
But it's very natural to think that whether some matter receives a soul is purely a matter of what's going on with that matter at that time, rather than its causal history,
Yeah.
which could involve things very deep in the distant past. Here's an argument for that claim. Yeah. So here's an argument for that claim. I think, in principle, maybe sometime down in the far future, we'll get to the point where we can create kind of from scratch, building up molecule by molecule, individual human embryos or human fetuses. And if you think that human embryos have immaterial souls when they're kind of naturally produced in the normal way, then I think it's very plausible to think that if we made one of these from scratch, molecule by molecule, physically identical to a human embryo, and kind of let it gestate in the normal way from there, that it also would have an immaterial soul.
Mm.
But notice that the embryo kind of created in the lab from scratch in the way I described, I guess I suppose that would count as an artifact, because by hypothesis, it's human beings who are intentionally putting the parts together
Right.
in a certain way. It certainly satisfies the normal historical criteria for artifacthood, but it would plausibly have an immaterial soul if we do. So that's an argument that whether something is an artifact cannot be the decisive factor as to whether it has an immaterial soul.
Yeah.
Now you might say, well, no, I've got some more heavyweight notion of artifacthood such that the lab created fetus doesn't count as an artifact. But now I want to say, okay, well, if being an artifact is not just a matter of being intentionally constructed by people, then and like some further condition is required, then A, I want to know what that further condition is, and B, I want to know like why you think the AI meets that further condition. Like
Right.
maybe
Right.
like if the lab created embryo doesn't count as an artifact, well, I don't know. It seems like totally open that maybe a functionally human like AI wouldn't count as an artifact either.
Yeah. Well, man, there's so many good things here to say. This is all gold. Um, yeah, it seems like what's the precise thing that's being picked out? So if you're building up from scratch a human, and it does receive a soul, and it's not an artifact, I think maybe someone would say it's not an artifact because you're like tapping into the natural kind person, and maybe just by accident or whatever you're making an isomorph of a human, but you don't know you can't give a precise point at which now it's a human being or anything like that. You just accidentally tapped into a natural kind. But if
Yeah.
that's the case, why think that like the human being is the natural kind and not like an immaterial soul soulish thing? Because then right, it would move right over to the AI machine. Like you made this AI. Why aren't you just tapping into the exact same like soul making metaphysical principles or you know y- nomological principles, whatever, that give rise to soulish things. So like then you'd have to pick out the natural kind and say no, we're picking out humans instead of ensouled things. You see what I'm like gesturing at there?
Yeah, so that makes sense. So yeah, one thing you might think is, okay, well, anything that belongs to a certain kind, a certain maybe natural kind, um, those are the things that get ensouled.
Yeah.
But then the question arises, as you're saying, okay, but how broad is that kind? If it's
Right.
broad enough, it might include the AI.
Yeah.
One way of thinking about this is, well, the relevant kind is individuated by its kind of functional and behavioral propensities. So anything with kind of functional and behavioral propensities appropriate for expressing a mental life, like does it naturally have the kind of uh, behavioral powers of the kind that would be needed to express a mental life? Those are the things that are eligible for souls. That's the relevant natural kind. But if
Hmm.
that's the relevant natural kind, then a functionally human-like AI would belong to the relevant kind. So there's
Yeah.
certainly an epistemic possibility that the natural kind that makes something eligible for soulhood is for ensoulment is narrower than that and excludes the AI. Maybe it just includes Homo sapiens,
Mhm.
or maybe it's a more disjunctive thing that would include Homo sapiens and the aliens, but somehow sidesteps the AI. I mean, that's certainly a possibility. That's why I'm not totally
Yeah.
certain that a functionally human-like AI would have a soul. But I guess it just seems to me that there's no very strong reason to think that whatever kindhood requirements are at play here would exclude a functionally human-like AI.
Yeah. That's good. I really like this. This is really fascinating. Initially was so taken by arguments against functionalism that I thought, well, just yeah, functionalism's false, or it doesn't say enough about what consciousness is, so it's kind of bunk, and therefore, robots can't think because they don't have souls. But folks like you and like Kenny Boyce on Facebook of all places have totally like opened my mind to this idea.